Hi, I am Brent Feldman, and this is the Matchbox Design Group podcast that is soon to be named potentially something different. But we're starting a podcast here at Matchbox Design Group to give you information on different tools that we use, certainly tips, tricks, things that we basically do at our company to help our clients get ahead. So today we're actually going to be talking with our UI UX designer, Alex Shaw. Hi, Alex.
Hello.
How's it going?
It's going good. I'm excited to finally start the podcast
Absolutely. I
and
know it's
talk about
actually.
Figma.
Woo! Go Figma.
Yes, I hopefully we can condense this in 30 minutes to an hour, but I think you and I both know that I could probably talk about it forever. So
Absolutely. I mean, what is there not to say wonderful about Figma? It's not just a figment of our imagination.
you're just going to start off the podcast with a pun.
Just bad
Is,
puns.
is again, this brings in the compilation aspect that we could probably make an entire video of puns throughout the podcast series.
I really hope so. I hope that we can, hopefully hold everybody's attention, even though there's going to be bad puns involved. So anyway, but I guess we should get to the meat of the content, which is exploring why we as a company use Figma. And I can definitely say that Alex is the person who really, brought using Figma instead of what we were formerly using, which was Sketch, to the team. Sketch is wonderful. It has a lot of, similar features and stuff to Figma, but Alex definitely brought a very compelling case to us about, why to potentially use it. And he definitely won over the dev team in terms of the exploration of like different files and looking into them on the back end that made it just, overwhelmingly compelling. And that's why we actually ended up switching everything from Sketch to Figma. Way back in the day, we actually used to do stuff in Photoshop, which, wow, I'm super glad that we don't do that anymore. And we were using a companion tool called Avocode. And Avocode was good. And I know there's things like Zeppelin out there that can certainly help, dig into these files and actually be a pairing to things like Sketch files or Figma files. But at the end of the day, we actually just use Figma, and then the dev team uses those Figma files to end up, building and constructing the websites that we put on the web. But anyway, all that being said, I think that maybe one of the first things to address is that, just as there's competitors like Sketch, there's also Adobe XD. And Alex, you've actually had an opportunity to kind of like do XD stuff as well beforehand, right?
Yeah, so XD was actually something I started out web design in back in 2017. And I believe Sketch was one of the first big programs to come out for web design. I think it was 2010 it came out, and XD and Figma didn't come until about 2016. But XD was the first one that I was introduced to just because I think as designers, everybody is used to the Adobe suite. And that was the program that Adobe created for web design. And it is a great program. But it seems to be that the majority of larger companies in the industry as a whole uses Sketch and Figma for a multitude of reasons.
Definitely. Yeah, it's really interesting because like XD was a product that seemed like it came out and it really did start to kind of like modernize or really focus the web design and layout and prototyping and all that sort of stuff in an Adobe product, which obviously Photoshop really never necessarily was designed for, or I guess, as we reflect on it, should have been used for in the first place. But it was definitely interesting to, see it be kind of used like that. And so anyway, so now, that we're kind of in this landscape after, having seen all these different competitors, what is the thing that really drew you to Figma?
Ooh, so I think the main thing, and this is coming from, first starting out as a designer, even before I started in my career, was I was primarily a Windows-based designer, which I know is not very common. It's more common now, but even going back to college days, a lot of colleges have you buy a MacBook because it just seems to be the common tool and the common OS that designers use. But given that I used a Windows computer, I needed something that ran on Windows. And unfortunately, Sketch does not do that. They are a Mac OS native app, which there are a lot of pros to that, but I think it obviously segments, a lot of potential users from using that specific app. And so that's why I originally got into Adobe XD for the first year or so, and then coming out of college, I learned about Figma. And one of the other reasons why that kind of stood out to me versus XD from the start was it was very collaborative. Whereas like Sketch and Adobe XD are really for designing and obviously handing off files to developers. But Figma was actually built from the ground up with collaboration in mind. So when you think about that and thinking about, well, eventually when I do get into a career, I'm going to be working with developers and everybody else on the team. I wanted to have some software that actually worked better with that. So that's how I started kind of getting into Figma. And then obviously the rest was history.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. And I mean, like, I can definitely, vouch for the fact that it's been a wonderful collaborative tool. Especially the fact that we basically fully operate remotely now. So, we're not in the office. We can't sit next to each other and poke around at a file or point to things. The collaboration helps, especially because we're remote. But I would say that it helps, in collaboration with the dev team. It helps in collaboration actually with clients so that they can review files. So yeah, I certainly I will second that point in being very, very helpful about Figma as a tool in general. And certainly think it's probably one of the best tools for collaboration. I know that Sketch definitely offers things like that, and more tools that we use are kind of getting those collaboration features, so that you can see multiple people within a file. But really, I think Figma is doing such a good job of it, and and we've had really, really good luck with using it with remote teams. So I guess that brings us to the kind of the features of Figma in general. And I definitely feel like collaboration is namely one of the highlight features. But what are some of the other features that you like as a part of Figma?
One that was introduced pretty early on, and it's still being worked on throughout the last couple of months, is auto layout. And really, what auto layout is you're able to create dynamic components that react to the content in the design, whether that is you're adding additional content or even taking some away. And as a result, you can really see how responsive the designs are from a tablet to mobile device, for instance. And something that I've seen compared to it, which it's not a complete one-to-one, but it's similar to like a CSS Flexbox, just in a design program. And we've really seen this being used recently in some of the projects that we've worked on, where typically, we have maybe 10 to 20 layouts given a project. And so we create all the layouts. And typically, if we needed to make a change to a certain block, um, we'd have to go through every single page where that block is located and make the change manually. And then you'd have to manually resize the frame, bring all the elements back together so they have the appropriate sizing. And I realized that that took a lot of time to do. And so just applying auto layout to some of the components, let's just say we wanted to add additional products on a product role in the design. All I would have to do is just drop them in. Everything would resize perfectly, and there's no additional work that needs to be done. And I think as designers, and especially Figma designers, start seeing how they're improving the auto layout feature. I mean, they started on the V1 feature, which brought some of those elements in, but it was still restrictive. And I think a couple months ago, they released V2, and they're actually starting on V3, I've seen on Twitter. And so they're going to be bringing some even additional elements to that. But it is such a powerful tool to have, and it makes doing iterations of your designs a lot faster.
That's awesome. That's cool. Yeah, I certainly feel like that is also another feature that's yeah, big standout. And what is kind of available in Sketch as well. In full transparency, I guess they definitely have some of those kind of features. But I feel like in Figma, it's very intuitive and definitely easy to use. And certainly for yeah, whether it be expanding designs, making designs more efficient and effective as you kind of create iterations, as you mentioned. Absolutely. Like, I feel like it works out pretty well. So I guess, are there any other features, you feel like that are important to touch on?
I really think the main thing, and it's not really necessarily a one feature kind of aspect, but it seems to be Figma is an almost an all-in-one tool. And I say that with air quotes because there's certain things that it is restrictive on. Of course, video editing. Yeah, obviously, it's not a video editing tool. However, because it is a web design tool, um, there's a lot of elements that you can do from that, and one of them is creating really nice working prototypes, which we've used for clients quite often. And it really does bring on a wow factor when you think about you're in a design program, there's no code to it, and you could see that if I click this button, an animation happens. And it's something that really does bring your designs to life right in Figma. And so going off of that, there's also the ability to obviously create vector images and vector designs, um, which is something that Sketch was known for not doing very well on. Typically when you use Sketch, a lot of people also use Illustrator in tandem with it. And so I know that, working at other companies that, if we needed icons or other illustrations, we open Illustrator, try to save them out as SVGs, and then import them into Sketch. And sometimes, importing them messes up the file. But in Figma, a lot of people have actually transitioned to just designing icons straight in Figma. And this is something that I've actually done. It's a little nerve-wracking at first, because you're used to Illustrator, if you design icons quite often, and it's very good at doing that. But Figma has these things called vector networks, which are essentially, the way vectors typically work is you have to go from, point A to point B, and then you have to connect it somewhere. Whereas Figma's vector networks really allow you to create complex shapes without having to reconnect the vectors. And there are tons of examples of people on Twitter creating like insane illustrations just in Figma. And so I just think the vectors alone is just a standout feature. But their plugin support allows you to bring in other plugins that maybe you want to create a 3D image, or maybe you want to create or do some photo editing, or even bring in a GIF and create a GIF. There are multiple things that you can do in Figma. So I do think it's turning into almost an all-in-one editing program. So if I would have had to say just an all-encompassing feature is that it's very versatile in whatever you can do with it.
That's awesome. Okay, cool. Well, I think the features are definitely there's quite a few, but I feel like that touching on those big ones is certainly important, especially for like design organizations, and first and foremost the collaboration part, and especially for like remote people. But yeah, definitely things that can kind of enhance it, be an all-in-one tool, especially when you're considering ditching, maybe another tool that you had formerly used. Not that you can't, also use something like Sketch. It could be duplicative to a certain extent, but like if you're using something like Photoshop, abandoning tools you could be very familiar with, moving to something else, you're like, oh, am I going to be able to do this or this or this? But it's good to know that, somebody who's in it and doing it on a daily basis, obviously those things exist and they're easy to use, and the transition it isn't too rough. So I guess that does kind of lead us to like other things just about it in general, and maybe the community aspect of it. This is kind of like the reason why we use WordPress. Not only did we think it was a great CMS, and they have absolutely, kind of wonderful, ability to, improve it and customize it and build it from the ground up. And we've been leveraging the WordPress platform for 12 years. But really having a good community around something can mean the world. Especially when you're looking for support for very, very niche issues. So anyway, I guess that was something that I know you had told me before, that the community is something that drew you to it.
Yeah, especially, I am not so active on Twitter, but when I realized that the Figma community is active on Twitter and their designers and developers are always listening, it actually brought me on the platform. And so most of the people I follow advocate for Figma, or actively create plugins or assets for it. Um, Something that, along the lines of the plugins that they have on Figma, they actually introduce a community tab. And so community members, whether that is somebody that does work at Figma or just a completely random designer or developer, can jump in there. They can share files. And something that is quite often, used is obviously browser assets, recreating the Google Chrome asset, recreating maybe Mac OS. Obviously, it would take a lot of time for every designer to do that on their own. And there are a lot of great people in the community who have just shared those files for everybody. And it's files that I use quite often. So the community aspect in Figma itself is fantastic. You can download plugins, you can follow people, see what people have created. That aspect is good on its own, but the meat of it really comes in Twitter, when we talk about Figma themselves interacting with a lot of the users. If you actually tweet Figma a certain feature, if it gets enough likes on it, they will actually implement the feature, which I feel like there could be some cons to that. Obviously, they're not going to do anything that's crazy, but there
Is
have
this
been
like
some.
Elon Musk's investments?
It,
That you tweet them and it gets enough likes, and then eventually they'll put it. Yeah, no matter how crazy.
Yes, actually, that's now that you mention it, it reminds me of that, because I know people have tweeted Elon Musk of, I want this feature on the Tesla, and he's like, okay, we'll implement it tomorrow. Not that they're that fast with implementing stuff, but there are certain features in Figma, or even certain like quality of life changes that people have requested, and they've allowed that to be implemented on Figma. So they really do listen to their customers, which is something that attracts me to certain companies. I know there are some companies that are just wall, and they don't listen to customers at all. But Figma really seems to be engaging into it. And it's really nice to see, especially in the design community.
That's cool. Well, you touched on plugins too, just a little bit. And certainly I know that's another kind of big highlight, not necessarily of the program in and of itself, but obviously the extensions of it, and the plugins can do so many different things, like a ridiculous amount of plugins that can be added to Figma in order to, yeah, whether it be like prototyping, but I mean, like, yeah, the list is vast. But I think if you could hone in on, yeah, just a few of like your favorites, what are those?
Oh, so like you mentioned, there are tons of plugins. And I think what's really nice is that um, anybody can really create a plugin for any reason at all. I mean, there are plugins for if you wanted to add lorem ipsum text into the design, there's a plugin for that. But the three that really stand out to me, is Themer is one of them, which I have previously used at my last job at Caleres. And it kind of has the intent in the name, in that you can easily create a theme and apply it to your designs. And I think the easiest example of this is, let's just say we're talking about like a light mode and a dark mode. If you're creating an app, for instance, if you create the styles, like, when you actually name the styles and save them to Figma, let's just say you wanted to create the style of font color or background color, and you save those styles as maybe white as the background color and black as, the font color. Obviously, if you had a ridiculous amount of app designs, going through and changing all that to a dark mode would take a long time. With this plugin, you can actually apply a dark mode style, and it will automatically switch out all the colors and change them from white to dark mode. And it has saved me a lot of time, especially if I am working with the same design, but obviously different brand colors is really where that feature comes into play. And the plugin is actually built by a Figma employee. So essentially, that they promised that it would always be updated, because that is a common thing with plugins, is that if you get too attached to a plugin, you don't know how long it's going to be, updated for. And so, at least with a lot of these plugins, they are built by prominent, community leaders in Figma or just in the design community. But I think Themer is a really good plugin if you need to quickly change styles.
That's awesome. Okay. Well, as far as plugins, really, that kind of sets the bar, but I think you had touched on a couple others like, maybe Figmotion and Automator. Anything big, that you feel like are kind of cool to talk about those?
Yeah, so Figmotion, like I touched on before, you can prototype in Figma, but there are certain limits. Obviously, a lot of people use Adobe After Effects for a lot of the prototyping, and even some other software that specifically touches on prototyping. But Figmotion brings in a lot of the cool elements, such as like keyframes and Bezier curves, that you can utilize in Figma and then export that out. But also, you can use that to save out and show a client what a particular, app interaction would be. And so it does enhance the prototyping a little bit. Of course, if you're somebody who is used to After Effects, you probably should keep, using After Effects. There are still some limitations, but it kind of just adds on to that. The bigger one, though, is Automator. And I left this one for last because this is probably the most exciting plugin that I've ever ran into. And it was actually so exciting that I bought the full license for it myself, for personal use. So essentially, Automator allows you to create automated systems using if-then statements. I'm not sure if you're familiar with like IFTTT
Of
or
course. Oh, yeah.
yes. So it uses that kind of same idea, but then applies it to Figma. So you can set certain elements like, if this happens, do this. And the stuff I've seen being able to create out of this is endless. I've seen simple things such as like, quickly creating a component out of, certain frames, all the way to you can actually import either an API, or you can actually import, let's just say, an Excel sheet that has information. Like if we were talking about shoes, you could have the shoe name, the shoe price, and maybe the size, all that implemented in an Excel sheet. You can put it into this plugin, and it will automatically add in the photo and all that information directly into the design without having to type anything.
That is
Um,
awesome.
yeah, so that is some of the crazy things that you can do with it. And the creator, once again, has been big in the Figma community, and they have promised that Automator is actually going to be updated for as long as they are in the community. And so it seems like it's probably not going to, get any, it's not going to stop updates anytime soon. But as of right now, the free version, you can only do 2 automations and then you're restricted. Whereas I believe it is $80 and you can actually have unlimited lifetime automations. So
That's awesome. It kind of brings, into that, like, bigger topic of like thinking about like, design almost in a programmatic sense, but not to make it, kind of banal or washed out or too repeated, but it's literally the consistency that, people are looking for, want to see in design, to where, and not to mention it's the efficiency. So you're not repeating every step, and having to, yeah, manually fill in content maybe where you wouldn't have to. But I definitely, I see a lot of potential value to that. I know that obviously we've been, really big on glowing about all the wonderful things that Figma can do, but, do you see any downsides to Figma, or using it in general, like anything that you feel like is just maybe, not wonderful?
Yeah, so even going back to what we talked about, like Sketch being a native app, the pro to that is that it is a native app, whereas Figma is a Chromium-based web app. And so the pro to that is obviously it can be used in the browser, which I have talked personally with some of our team members, which they absolutely love being able to use and just being able to save it in their browser and being able to open it anytime. The downside of that is because it is Chrome based and because it is browser based, it does eat up a lot of memory, which is something that I sort of ran into at a previous job where we had an insane amount of components in a Figma file. And at the time, Figma hadn't released certain features that would allow us to create variants of certain components. So we had to make a separate component for each variant of, let's just say, a button that we wanted to create. And so what we ran into is that eventually, when the file got so big, and we're talking about 1,000+ components in the file, that there's actually a memory limit that Figma implements because it is a Chromium-based app. And so when we realized that, we had to actually separate certain components out into a separate Figma file. Now, Figma has introduced a lot of features, like I said, with the variants to kind of minimize that. But if you're somebody that would potentially have thousands of components in a single Figma file, that's probably not the best way to go about it, and you probably will hit some kind of memory cap.
Yeah, certainly, definitely, understand software limitations, but at the same time can be potentially, problematic. That is definitely not to say that it can't happen on the Sketch side. You can definitely get really, large files there, maybe not hitting the memory limit, of course, as it's, kind of like a native application, or not in the same regard. And then certainly, oh gosh, Photoshop files can be giant.
Ooh.
Yeah. But anyway, I guess all that being said, that certainly there's still, kind of like downsides to everything, but for the most part, we've certainly enjoyed, all the, kind of major upsides that we've had to it. So anyway, I guess that kind of brings us to, maybe one of the last, things, which is really the dev team. I know that obviously you introduced this to them as being a big kind of improvement potentially, versus Sketch, as to how they could interact with it, exporting, assets out of it. And I know there are definitely, again, some similarities there, but at the same time, we've certainly gotten our dev team on board with it. They seem to love it as well. So yeah, anything else that you feel like is super important to note about dev teams, kind of using or leveraging Figma files?
Yeah, so I'll say that while Sketch does have the collaboration aspect to it, which actually they just released like about a year ago, so they're very late to the party for that regard. But also, I realize that there are certain limitations for Sketch in that regard. So, because Figma is browser based and is Chromium based, um, anybody can access the file at any time. Because you don't need to be on necessarily a Mac or Windows computer or Linux, really anything that has a browser, you can access a Figma file in, which has been amazing, especially when we send it to clients. Whereas Sketch, you actually need to have the latest native app downloaded, and everybody working in the file needs to have that same version, or else they can't collaborate on there. Whereas because Figma doesn't really necessarily have native updates in that regard, anybody can jump in the file and you can see them working. Of course, we have a limited amount of editors, but when it comes to our developers or anybody else on the team or even clients, they're able to go in there, see us working in real time, and be able to pull out assets, whether that is actual design assets or even the code they can pull from Figma. Um, it's always nerve-wracking when you talk to developers about completely switching to a different program. I think people get used to the workflow of a certain program, and you really do have to convince them on being able to switch. And I think even them just diving into Figma and seeing everybody in there real time being able to comment on the files and comment on the designs, I didn't have to do much work to sell them on that. And as far as I know, they've been overjoyed by being in Figma. And I don't think anybody is sad necessarily from moving from Sketch to Figma.
Definitely. Yeah, I know also too personally with some of those interactions of just increased documentation, definitely the ability to make comments and stuff on the back end. It's been really nice, sort of like the workflow and stuff that we've established between design and development in order to, make sure that, yeah, not only was it a smooth transition, but it still, kind of had lasting benefits and stuff for us too. So, all in all, obviously, yeah, I guess you give it your resounding endorsement, huh?
I do. I do. And I know there is an internal joke of the last two teams I've been on. I have actually convinced everybody to switch from Sketch to Figma. Not that I obviously just wholeheartedly think that Sketch or Figma is the best thing in the world. But I think at the end of the day, it really depends on what you and your team needs. And it seems like the last two teams I've been on, that Sketch and the problems that come around it have been a pain point.
Mhm.
You mentioned that you used to use Avocode or Advocode.
Mhm.
I previously used Zeppelin, and we also had to use Abstract to even view the files and edit the files. Whereas Figma, we've just had to use Figma. Plugins were really built for Sketch to help utilize Sketch and collaborate on it. But what I've loved about Figma is that you can just use Figma. You don't need anything else to design, to develop, or to even look at it as a client. It's just overall a great program.
That's awesome. Well, cool. Well, Alex, I have to tell you, thank you so much. I know, obviously, not only introducing this, to our team, but also for telling, everybody else a little bit about it too. And so, just for, in general, this is the first of hopefully many podcasts and kind of video podcasts that we'll basically do for our company, not only exposing some of the tools that we use, but just about agency life, all sorts of stuff. Can't wait to bring more content to you. Definitely, thank you again. My name is Brent Feldman. Alex, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Have a good one. Bye.